And welcome to Unit 9, Modules 45 and 46. We're talking about development from conception, in utero, and in infancy. So here are your learning objectives, and here are your vocab. So this unit, developmental psychology, we will be talking about physical, cognitive, and social changes that occur from conception until late adulthood and death. So there are three major issues that are looked at and researched in developmental psych. And the first one is familiar to you. That's the nature versus nurture debate. And then continuity and stages. And the third one is stability and change. And I'm going to go over each one. So nature and nurture is familiar to you. And a lot of things like we've discussed are both, right? So our genes are what give us, like nature gives us something. And then after that, nurture or our environment influences what genes are expressed. So we're predisposed to certain things, certain traits, and then the environment kind of chooses in a way what gets expressed. So a lot of things are bio, psycho, social. Just a note here that the womb is part of our environment. Sometimes people think that it's part of nature, but it's actually nurture. So we are a creation of interaction, interaction just being a previous vocab that means a combination of the biological, psychological, and sociocultural influences. When developmental psych looks at these things and compares everyone, what they really find is that we share more things that are similar with each other than are different. We like to look at the differences, and yes, in any given individual and another, we can find a lot of individual differences, but when we look at the human species, there are so many similarities. So the next debated topic is continuity and stages. So the question being, are there clear-cut stages that we go through in development, or is it more like a gradual and slow cumulative development and change? So three famous stage theorists are Lawrence Kohlberg, who came up with a moral stages theory, Erik Erikson, who came up with the psychosocial stages theory, and Jean Piaget, who came up with the cognitive development stages. So they would definitely say that life happens in these organized stages, that this thing happens at this age, and then after you go through that, you go into this next thing. There is some research to indicate that really life and development is not so neat and organized, and that some of these things are happening simultaneously or out of order. But the general idea of stages is kind of useful when you're looking at the whole lifespan and seeing like what's typical for the psychosocial way of thinking for a 5-year-old versus a 25-year-old. The third debated topic and research topic is stability and change. And so these researchers look at, are our traits more changing as we age, or are they more stable? So for example, some traits like temperament, which is our emotional excitability or our emotional reactivity, that generally is stable. Meaning if you were a very emotionally reactive infant, then you tend to be like that as an adult. There are some fluctuations, especially around adolescence, because you are more socially influenced. But generally, when we look at, even 40-year studies, these things tend to stay stable. Other things that stay stable are your hyperactivity levels, your impulsivity, your talkativeness, your humility, those things tend to stay the same. Some things that change are our social attitudes that kind of change as we start to think about things differently, depending on our age. Our conscientiousness, our self-confidence, our agreeableness, those all tend to go up as we age. So think about how they might go down in adolescence, and then as you kind of grow into and be more comfortable with yourself in adulthood, those grow stronger. So now let's look at the physical development in the womb. So a woman has a set number of eggs when she is born. They are immature eggs, and 1 in 5,000 will mature and be released. So every month, one is released in theory, sometimes more than one. So if 2 eggs get released, then it's possible to have fraternal twins. Men begin producing sperm cells around puberty, and there are about 200 million sperm trying to fertilize 1 egg. So 1 sperm will fertilize 1 egg, and that will create a zygote, which we'll talk about in a second. So remember that there are fraternal and identical twins, and this little chart will review that. I'm not going to go over that again, even though you still need to know that information because it's review. So prenatal, the first step, the first stage is the zygote, and that is when you have the 1 sperm, 1 egg, and it gets fertilized, and it fuses together and makes 1 cell, and that cell starts to divide into 2, 4, etc. And so about day 10, when it's still a zygote, it will attach to the uterine wall, and it's kind of going to hang around, and the embryo is when you start to get the development of important organs. They're nowhere near ready to sustain life yet, but they are starting to be created. The heart begins to beat. 1 in 270 embryos will split, meaning they will become identical twins because that's 1 egg, 1 sperm, right? And they're splitting. And 9 weeks until birth, it is now called a fetus. And around the 6-month stage is when you have certain organs, such as the stomach, developing enough that they can sustain life outside of the womb. So when babies are born, they actually have several abilities. They recognize mother's voice, and they prefer the voice of a woman because that's what they're familiar to. They even prefer hearing mother's language, and their cry actually has the same intonation as the mother's language. So if the language is something like German has an different intonation than Spanish, and so it will actually like imitate that in their cry. Teratogens, these are anything that can cause harm to the baby in utero. So this could be drugs, it could be alcohol, it could be like the amount of mercury in their system from certain fish that they're eating. The placenta tries to basically like screen these things out so that they don't happen, but some things it can't really do that too. So if a mother is consuming alcohol regularly when pregnant, the baby can develop fetal alcohol syndrome. And this can cause some serious birth defects. It can cause physical abnormalities, cognitive, and it's a lifelong issue that that child will now have to deal with. And they're actually also more prone to alcoholism. Alcohol also has an epigenetic effect on genes, meaning it leaves a chemical mark. It alters one's gene. So at birth, babies have certain reflexes. So some of these are rooting. Rooting is if a baby's cheek gets touched, it will turn to whatever side is being touched. And this is a reflex to search for food. So generally turn actually and open their mouth expecting food. Sucking is also a reflex related to food. This is essential for their survival. Some babies are premature and they might not be able to do this yet. They might not have this reflex yet, and so they actually have to teach them how to do this. The Moro reflex is the startle reflex. The doctor will kind of hold the baby up and then create this space where it's like it kind of gives the sensation that the baby's falling just for like a tiny, tiny bit. And the baby will actually go like this, put its arms up and kind of go, and it might cry, but it's called the startle reflex. And they even do this to themselves when they're like sleeping. They can experience this startle reflex. If you've ever seen a newborn and they're like all cozy and sleepy, and then all of a sudden they're like, and they like freak out because they did that. So they grasping, so pressing into their palms, they will grasp a finger or whatever it is, and they will also grasp their toes will actually curl, and if you press the bottom of their foot. So other things that we notice with babies, habituation. So this is trying to understand babies' cognition. So with showing them the same thing repeatedly, they actually show boredom, they look away, they're uninterested. If something is new or surprising, they will stare at it longer, like, what just happened, right? So things that get their attention. So we know that they've kind of learned to expect things, then they have habituated it. Infants, just like adults, they prefer to look at faces, and that again is important for development, to look at someone's face and kind of learn all of the things they can learn by watching mom and dad or whoever talk to them. So maturation is our biological growth processes that cause change in our behavior. It could be our motor development, our cognitive development, or whatever. They're generally based on nature, not nurture. So using nouns before adjectives, that's just something people do, and it's not because of the environment, it's just the way we develop cognitively. In terms of our cognitive abilities, our association areas are usually one of the last things to develop. Remember, those are in the cerebral cortex, and they're responsible for thinking and memory. And so as those things strengthen, those abilities strengthen. Our motor development, so our cerebellum is going through rapid development in that first year of life especially. And so the general marker, so approximate age at which babies tend to walk, is about 12 months. 90% by 15 months. So that's like our, range. Identical twins tend to walk either on the same day or almost the same day. So again, showing you that nature piece of our development. And there's a whole list of other things that we start to do, right? We tend to crawl before we walk. So there's a certain thing, even though we're not looking at our parents crawling. So it's not imitation, it's our abilities developing a certain way. And no matter what part of the world, that is the development. Infantile amnesia is review, just the idea that we do not remember things that happened to us before 3. We do keep our implicit memory, so our learning of language, our learning to walk, all of those things we keep with us, but we wouldn't be able to explain when we learned them or how we learned them because that's explicit memory. But implicit, we're able to keep skill. So takeaways. Remember the 3 major debates in psych development: nature-nurture, continuity in stages, and stability and change over time. Temperament is our emotional reactivity, and that tends to stay stable in our lifespan. Remember the order of development. It goes zygote, embryo, fetus. Remember the reflexes that maturation applies to our genetic development. We tend to do these things in a certain order regardless of our culture. Walking or crawling before walking, using nouns before adjectives, etc. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this